Everything in life is connected, and today's video is about the time when a priest, an economist, philosophy and science combined to produce one of the finest achievements in the history of mankind. That everything is connected is one of the main themes of philosophy, and also the reason why I believe one should bother to read philosophy, because it's actually the only field that concerns itself with the big picture. All other fields, they specialize, and I think that if you specialize, there is a bit of a danger that you might lose sight of the big picture. Now, when I say that, and want to give a few examples, my thoughts immediately go to science, because I like to read about science. And also there was a conversation fairly recently I had with a scientist. Now, during this conversation, I made the argument, a particular argument, using scientific facts as well as reason and logic to now get my point across. And the scientist, he sort of was quite critical about this approach. And he told me that in science, you can't use reason and logic. Science is limited to the scientific method, and that being to observe and to test. And that in science, you cannot use reason and logic, because that, according to this scientist, that is not objective. Reason and logic, according to him now, is a subjective thing. Now, I must say I'm not quite sure I agree with that in the first place. But I also wonder, is that not maybe why, or is that not the difference between a good scientist and a great scientist? I think that perhaps the great scientists, they do not limit themselves in this way. I think people like, for instance, Einstein and Darwin and Stephen Hawking, for instance, they very much also considered reason and logic, and very importantly, their imagination, to think about science and to then move forward with any issue that they want to solve. Now, talking about Einstein, in this particular book called What Scientists Think, Jeremy Stangroom, the editor, there was an interview with Steve Jones, and the topic being Darwinism and genes. And in this article, Steve Jones argues that DNA evidence and genes support the fact that all life is connected, is akin to each other. And he also argues that DNA evidence supports Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. But during this particular interview, for some reason, Steve Jones found it necessary to criticize philosophy, to get a dig into philosophy, calling philosophy largely useless. Now, that, I must say, is a bit disappointing and strange for me, because in the first place, philosophy was the start of all science, and every strand of science started with a philosophical question. And the topic that he's now talking about, Charles Darwin, in this particular interview, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, natural selection, that came about through a philosophical question, and philosophical question that has been that people has been trying to solve for hundreds of years. And the question being, why is there such diversity of life on Earth? That is a philosophical question that even in Greek philosophers' time they try to sort of answer. And I think that most people agree that Charles Darwin is actually the first person to properly answer that particular question. Now, it's well documented um, that Charles Darwin, as a young man, sailed on the Beagle all over the world, where he now observed and collected samples. And for instance, in the Galapagos Islands, he observed, um, for instance, that on the one island, the tortoises look different than the tortoises on another island. That's the type of observation that he made, collected samples of all sorts of birds and so on, that also differed slightly from island to island. And then after a couple of years, he returned to England, where he then, at his house, Down House, he then worked on this question: why is there such diversity on Earth, diversity of life on Earth? And okay, this is now my view on it, and I think at that stage he had like a vague theory. But now Charles Darwin, he credits a particular person to give him the light bulb moment for his theory that came out later. And the person that he credits was Thomas Malthus. Now, Thomas Malthus, he was an Anglican priest, uh, and he lived during the period 1760s to the 1830s. Now, he was a priest who was very much interested in economics, and later on he also became a professor at economics. But he wrote a book on population. The growth of population is something that interested him and concerned him. And in this particular book, he made the argument that population growth um, is dependent on the production of resources to sustain that population growth. So he was concerned that at some stage the population growth all over the world is going to outstrip the resources. So that was the gist of his book. But now, when Charles Darwin read this particular book and read about um, Malthus arguing that there is amongst human beings a struggle for existence and a struggle to get hold of these resources. That was his light bulb moment, and that provided the spark then eventually for his theory on natural selection, the evolution theory. And he specifically said that was his light bulb moment. That is when he started to realize, but that's the theory where he can start working on. And the important thing is that although Charles Darwin is famous for the evolution theory, he wasn't the only person that came up with the idea at that specific time. There was another guy by the name of Russell Wallace that came up with the same idea. And Russell Wallace, well, he became less known as than Charles Darwin because he didn't write a book about it. Charles Darwin did. But Russell Wallace also credits Thomas Malthus' book on population for the inspiration of getting the same idea than Charles Darwin. So my argument being that everything is connected, and that if Charles Darwin and Russell Wallace, if they only concentrated on a specific topic and only on maybe the scientific method, I doubt if they would have read then about population and get that inspiration to proceed with their theories. So once again, I think this illustrates that everything is connected, and that philosophy is very important in science.